Today we're reviewing the Ryzen 7 7700 Non-X. It's a new CPU. It follows up the X SKU. This one's $330, so it comes in theory, $70 below the original 7700X launch price. However, the 7700X for a while now, like a month or more now, has been closer to the $345, $360 mark. So when this review goes live, maybe that'll change because there'll probably be some reduced interest in the 7700 Non-X otherwise if they're only 15 bucks apart. But either way, the pricing is what makes this chip interesting. It is a lower TDP option, and we're going to look at it including some PBO testing. Before that, this video is brought to you by the Height Y60. The Height Y60 is one of the most unique cases to launch anytime recently, coming in multiple color options like this bright red, and it's also built for both water cooling and air cooling. The case pays extreme attention to detail, particularly with cable management paths like you can see with the quality rubber grommets that are always passed through, and with split lower and upper chambers. Learn more at the link in the description below. Okay, so the 7600 review went up earlier today. That contains more detailed information at the start of it for what exactly these CPUs are, how PBO affects them, and what TDP really means. So you can check that video for those isolated sections if you want to learn more about that stuff. But ultimately, because these are reduced TDP, you should expect some performance loss. However, as we showed in our eco mode testing with the 7950X, AMD CPUs at their stock settings for the X class, so 7700X, 7900X, and so forth, don't really gain that much versus when you cut them down significantly in TDP, to a limit anyway. And that's because they are running way past the sort of efficiency, the optimal point on the efficiency curve, and we're sort of down in that diminishing returns area with it. So these CPUs then get most of the performance, less power, and in theory less money. They also include a stock cooler, while not particularly powerful, is something to get you started, at least. So here's a quick table to get everyone up to speed. There are three new CPUs from AMD. There's a 6-core 7600 at $230. There's a 12-core 7900 at $430, which we're reviewing next. And there's an 8-core 7700 that we're reviewing here today. That one's $330. Now, on paper, these are the same thing as the original X parts with reduced power. They launch tomorrow, which is January 10th at the time this goes up. And the X SKU part prices are all over the place. So in our conclusion, we're going to talk about it from two different angles, which will be original pricing versus what we think it'll probably be. And then you can kind of pick based on what the scenario is when you're buying. So we have one more note to make. We have a couple of 4090 tests in here. They didn't change much for this one. Maybe it'll be more interesting for the 7900, but it's okay. We needed to refresh all the data anyway. So time not lost, but the 3090 Ti is still keeping up with these for the most part. Okay. Let's get started with some benchmarks. Our first gaming test is Far Cry 6 at 1080p, where the Ryzen 7 7700 landed halfway up our chart at 164 FPS average. That has it within variance of the 7700X and tying with the 12700KF. Applying PBO effectively did nothing for performance here, but it was worth a shot. Looking back generationally, the 7700 is able to run the game 17% faster than the 5800X. Meanwhile, the 58X3D with its larger cache is 10% ahead of the 7700. The 5800X 3D does particularly well in Far Cry, and it's currently retailing for about $350, so that's why it's still part of this conversation. It's similar in price, it's still a solid choice, it just happens to be on a dead-end platform. At this point, the obvious CPU to beat is the 13600K, which outperformed the 7700 Non-X by 12% here. But if you're trying to get the most bang for the buck with the brand new system, the 7600 Non-X that we just reviewed is only 9 FPS average behind the 7700 here for $100 cheaper. That leaves the 7700 in an awkward position where it's being beaten by its closest competitors and losing on value to the lower end SKU of its own product line. The next one on the list is Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 1080p. The 7700 ran at 258 FPS average, tied with the 7700X, and within 2% of the 13600K. Since it's starting to look like the X and the Non-X might frequently be tied, we re-ran Tomb Raider with the RTX 4090 to get better scaling. Here's the chart with the 4090 in the bench. With the added GPU power, the 7700X actually pulls out a 4% margin over the stock 7700. That's not anywhere near enough to matter, considering the price difference and the fact that most 4090 users should probably be gaming above 1080p. and with better CPUs, honestly. The 7700 is also 5% faster than both the 7600 and the 13600K, so for value, we're going to have to go with the 7600 for this one. Again, $100 for 5%. It's just not worth spending that much more. As for the 58X3D, it pulls ahead of everything else here. Tomb Raider is just one of those games that, in this instance, is benefited by it. Final Fantasy XIV is our only MMO in this suite, but maybe that'll change later this year. We use the standalone Endwalker benchmark to generate our data here. This is an online-only game, so you might not see these frame rates in crowded areas with other players, but this is a pretty good synopsis to set you up. We recorded the 7700 at 223 FPS average, putting it within variants of the 7700X. Something we're starting to see in this benchmark is an affinity for the single CCD Ryzen CPUs over the ones with two. For example, the 7950X or the 7900X with two. It's possible that this difference is due to latency penalties when information has to travel across the interconnects between the CCDs. AMD advised us of behaviors like this during the original Ryzen 7000 launch, and it's interesting to see our dataset reflecting that. Something else in this benchmark that it has an affinity for is apparently Intel 13th gen chips, because on this chart, the 13600K holds a 13% performance advantage over the 7700. The 13900K in particular really pulls ahead, but it also costs over $600, not quite the same category. Moving on to Rainbow Six Siege at 1080p, a game with frame rates that we take very seriously and never joke about, the 7700 falls in our just over 600 FPS average bucket, along with the rest of Zen 4. The 5800X3D is in here also, and so is the 13600K. The game isn't fully GPU capped here, which is evidenced by the 13900K, even though when we put a 4090 in, the FPS goes up. We'll look at that later. But it just so happens to be that this is a common landing point for a wide range of CPUs. If you're still on an earlier Zen chip and really enjoy competitive games like this, you'd get a massive uplift. The 7700 is 91% faster than the 2700 here, so it's maybe worth considering an upgrade. That said though, for a brand new build, we'd rather point you to the cheaper 7600 or maybe to the Intel 13600K. Anything more expensive than the 7600 just for Rainbow Six though is really not worth it, including the 136. Don't overlook the drop-in AM4 upgrades though, because the 5600X and 5800X do extremely well in their current street pricing as well. We're still rebuilding the pool of tests for F122 after a major game update, so there's not as much here. The results show all Ryzen 7000 CPUs behaving very similarly with this, with all of them within variants of the 7700. Outside of that, the 13700K holds a 3% lead over the 77 in average FPS, and interestingly, the 7700 at stock has more consistent frame times versus its contemporaries, with especially the 0.1% lows being a bit higher. We ran several games with the 4090 in the bench, because we're just starting to collect that data now. So for sake of pitting the 7700 against the 7700X, it actually didn't matter. None of them except Tomb Raider gave a meaningful scaling between the two parts. We'll be gradually switching over to running all game CPU benchmarks with the 4090. It's just not that important here. If you'd like to study any of these charts, feel free to pause the video, but we're going to be moving on to production now. In an all-core workload, the R7 7700 pulled 89 watts, similar to the power consumption we saw on the R5 7600 CPU. The 5600X stands as a reminder of what AMD's old formula produced for 65 watts. AMD back then used a different thermal resistance to calculate the TDP. That's why the number is so much lower and why it's incomparable. The true power draw, 89 watts on the 7700, is what will dictate your cooler performance. PBO pushed the 7700 way up, landing at 138 watts, or 55% ahead of the stock result. We're trading a massive amount of power for single-digit performance increases, as you'll see in a moment. The 7700X is higher still, at 148 watts total. So this feeds back into the same conversation we had during our eco mode testing. AMD is past the efficiency curve's optimal point when shipping with the stock settings, on the X CPUs at least. But the non-X CPUs are basically an eco-moded X CPU, just for cheaper. For comparison, the 13600K pulled 161 watts in the same test. It'll be faster in most benchmarks coming up, but it's also pulling more power. And that leads us to efficiency, where we need to look at the work accomplished versus the power consumed during the course of work. In other words, if it consumes more power but it gets the same work done faster, like in Blender, it could still be more efficient than a lower power consumption part that takes longer to finish the workload. In our efficiency chart, the R7 7700 required 18.8 watt-hours of energy, ranking it among the most efficient results on this chart. The 7600 was less efficient at 24.4 watt-hours, but it pulled the same power, you might have noticed. So that means that it has completed the work slower, even though it was pulling the same power. Therefore, it consumed more power in total, or energy, more appropriately. The i5-13600K isn't particularly strong by comparison, despite being at least average overall. That one needed 28.7 watt-hours to render, allowing AMD's 7700 a significant efficiency lead at 35% less energy consumed for the same work. So AMD's strong point remains where it has been, which is efficiency, even though Intel has been sort of taking the value from it. Blender testing is up next. For this testing, we rendered a scene with Blender Cycles rendering. The R7 7700 completed the render in 12.7 minutes, with the PBO offset improving that by 3%. It's actually one of the larger gains we saw. The 7700X ran at 12 minutes, or 5.5% faster than the 7700. The 12700KF remains superior to all these results, with the more interesting and modern 13600K leading the 7700 non-X by 16%. Considering the 13600K is about the same price, assuming the 7700 holds at its launch price, the 13600K is the better option. Its performance is higher, its motherboard entry cost is lower, and its CPU price is lower than the 7700. The 7700X at $345 as we write this, but it's going up, is even less compelling. We don't see how to justify the 7700 singularly in this benchmark as compared to the 13600K. Chromium Code Compile is up next. In this one, we're testing the time required to compile a code base. Obviously, this isn't representative of all compile workloads, just like any one game isn't representative of all of them, but it gives us a baseline to work with. Chromium Code Compile has the AMD R7 7700 stock CPU at 66.7 minutes to complete the render, with PBO boosting us to 65.6 minutes. So for PBO, that means we got a reduction in time required of 1.6%. It's really not worth it. And that's compared to the XSKU, which has its own 64.3 minute result, so that at most is a 3.6% advantage for the 7700X over the 7700 non-X with no PBO. The Intel i5-13600K blows it out of the water though. Its 55-minute result has its time requirement reduced by 18% from the 7700. At the same price, or even a remotely similar one, the 13600K is just better value. If you were dead set on buying the 7700 or the 7700X, we'd say just get the non-X for this type of workload. It's not sufficiently different, and you could manually tune beyond what we did with PBO if you wanted the last percentage point. Technically, the X is faster, but any more than a $20 difference, and it's really just not worth it. 7-zip compression is up next. This one measures file compression speed in millions of instructions per second, or MIPS. The AMD R7 7700 stock CPU completed 119K MIPS, with PBO giving the 7700 a 1.6% boost to performance. It's not much. The 7700X ran at 1.4% ahead of the 7700 with PBO, or 3% ahead of the 7700 stock. Intel's closest price competition, the 13600K, ran at 131,000 MIPS, so it's a better performer as compared to all of the 7700 options, despite a price that's basically the same. This just shows why Intel earned the Best CPU of 2022 award from us with the 13600K. It's well-rounded, and it punches above its weight class and value. In the very least, the jaunt over the R5 7600 is massive. The 7700 stock CPU leads the 76 stock CPU's 94K result by 26%. Decompression is up next. This is tested in the same application. It's just the inverse function to compression. The 7-zip decompression result had the 7700 pull ahead of the 13600K. AMD is advantaged in this workload, so that makes sense. The 7700 stock result has a technical lead over the i5 of 1.4%. It's not worth the losses in most of the other tests, but at least it's a technical victory. As for the XSKU, it's 4% ahead of the non-X. Once again, it's not much, and PBO meets the two halfway while maintaining the cheaper price of the non-X option. Even if you do a lot of decompression, the 7700 just isn't worth it here as compared to the 13600K. The next big jump in performance is also a big jump in price, starting at the 13700K or the R9 7900X. In Adobe Premiere, we're testing file saves, scrubbing, and live playback. We also test rendering, filters, and other effects functions with the Puget suite. The premier benchmarks had the R7 7700 at 995 points, leading the R5 7600 stock CPU by 17%. While that's a meaningful gap, the 13600K is less meaningful here than in other places. The lead over the 7700 is reduced to 2.7%. So it's a lot closer of a call than the 16 to 20% swings we see in some other places. As for the 7700X, it's about 3% ahead of the non-X. Our last production test is for Adobe Photoshop. In this one, like in Premiere, we used Puget Suite to score the aggregate result of transforms, filters, warps, and other Photoshop functions. The stock 7700 result had it at 1475 points, with PBO technically boosting to 1482, but not meaningfully changing the result. An actual person wouldn't notice this difference even if the chart will. The 7700X is more significantly improved, something we also observed in the 7600 stock versus the 7600X stock behavior. The 7700X here is 7.5% faster than the non-X, which is one of the most noteworthy gains we've seen between them in all of these charts. Still not worth much more than 10 or 20 bucks though. The 13600K's 1502 point result had it between both results, so it's a better choice than the 7700, but if the 7700X is close in price to the 13600K, it's technically better. Value favors the 136K with prices at the time of writing though. So all of this makes the 7700 kind of a weird part. We can't really recommend it. It's not a bad CPU. It's just not positioned competitively. So it works fine. The numbers are fine, but there are better options. The 13600K, and if you're looking at like a 7900, the 13700K are extremely competitive now. It's really weird because AMD launched the 7000 series a little too expensive. In the case of the 7600X rather, far too expensive. And Intel came out, and not only was it in some places more affordable, but also better in those competing areas. So AMD's got some ground to make up, and they've kind of traded roles where as reviewers who spent half a decade looking at Intel as the more expensive option, but it was stuck on the same architecture and the same core count forever, it's kind of weird to look at the market now and go, wow, they're both actually really trying. That's great. CPU market's really interesting right now. So some of the points to recap here, the 7600, it's commonly a few percentage points behind the 7700 in gaming, and it's $100 less. And it even technically surpasses it in CSGO, but they're close enough, it doesn't really count. If you're able to spend in the low $300 range on a CPU, you should be looking at the 13600K instead. It's either functionally tied with the 7700, like in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, or taking a notable lead like it does in Final Fantasy by 13%. That's not even taking into account the fact that you can still build a cheaper system with 13th gen by going with DDR4 instead of DDR5, which isn't an option on AM5. So it is beset on all sides by alternatives. If you go cheaper, the 7600, if you want to stay on AMD, in gaming it makes more sense. So you get into production, that's a different story because the extra cores do actually help. But for gaming, this CPU, we really don't think it makes much sense. For production, the 13600K makes more sense in almost every scenario. And if we look at some of those numbers, in 7-zip, the 7700 does okay. It compresses 26% faster than, say, the 7600, but it generally falls apart in comparison to the 13600K. Intel's E-cores really shine and stuff like this. For example, the 13600K completed the Chromium codebase compile in 18% less time than the 7700. The only place where the 7700 took a meaningful lead over the 13.6 is in 7-zip decompression, and that's only marginally better in an AMD Advantage test. As for PBO, we could highlight any set of PBO versus stock results for this CPU, and there's really no difference. Sometimes it gets it closer in proximity to the 7700X. You see this more in production than you do in gaming, but for the most part, enabling PBO, the little bit you do get in sort of the lower gaining applications or games, it's enough to make it probably worth just saving, even if it's only $15, the extra $15 and not buy the X and get the lower end one instead, or technically lower end, and then just turn PBO on, and there you go. You get 99-ish% of the performance, maybe 97, and it's cheaper. The one place we could say the 7700 does shine is in power efficiency. So in that testing, it looked pretty good. It pulled ahead of all the other current gen stock results from AMD and from Intel alike. If you have some kind of use case where you're going to put this in a box that burns some CPU load 24/7, that efficiency might become desirable. But stick around for a 7900 review as well. And if you have the money, you can look at the 7950 with eco mode because that's pretty good there too. So as for where we think it should fall, it needs to be under $300 to be seriously worth talking about and considering, and not $299 AMD, but like actually under 300, meaningfully under. And currently, we don't see the angle for the CPU. The 7700X currently, it looks a little bit worse thanks to the 7700, but that's the only angle we see to it existing. And honestly, the prices are probably going to shuffle some more. One of them has to go either up or down because they're too close right now, and there's going to be a bias towards purchasing one or the other. So as soon as the market figures out what that bias is, the prices will diverge further. We don't think this is worth buying currently. We think it needs to be sub 300. The 7700X, more or less the same conclusion. And then come back for the 7900 review because that one is really interesting. They're pretty competitive. But that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more as always. You can go to store.gamersnexus.net to support us directly or patreon.com/gamersnexus. We'll see you all next time.